Today we're going to talk about understitching. Some of your patterns may call for understitching. That is when we stitch the seam allowance of a seam towards one side or the other. And oftentimes this is done when there's a facing involved. So I have a dress that I'm working on, and it has a neck facing that needs to be understitched. And the understitching will help keep the neck facing inside without popping out. That's the main tool of an understitching, is to keep something rolled to the inside so it doesn't peek out of the top. Then we also need to understitch this pocket, because the pocket needs to lay flat outwardly before we stitch it to the other side. So we're going to understitch the pocket, and that will keep our pocket from popping out of the side of our skirt at some point or another. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do with my neckline facing is to clip the curves. Because it's a curved seam, it's going to lay down better if we clip in the curved areas. So I'll take a nice pair of sharp scissors, and what I'm doing is I'm just clipping every inch or so right up to but not through the stitches. And that's going to help the neck relax once we start stitching our facing. The next step in understitching, we do it from the outside, and you can either do it by pinning a lot of people start actually by pinning their facing to the seam allowance, and I'm just folding it over. I'm not even pressing it with the iron. I'm just folding that seam allowance over towards the facing and pinning it down about 1/8 of an inch from the seam. This helps hold it down. If you're an experienced sewer, you don't really need to pin it. You can just feel for it and move it over. But this is a good way when you're starting to understitch, and also it'll help show you where you're supposed to pin, or where you're supposed to stitch rather. So I'm pinning my seam allowance, and you can see here's the seam on this side, and then here's the seam on this side. So we're pinning the seam allowance towards the facing, and then we're going to stitch that seam allowance down on the facing side about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. We really don't want it any more than 1/8 of an inch or any less than 1/8 of an inch. When we get too close to the seam, the stitching becomes ineffective. So, and if we get too far away from the seam, the same thing happens. So 1/8 of an inch is a good, effective way of stitching that seam allowance to the facing. Okay, I have my facing pinned, and I'm going to now stitch it down. I'm making sure to keep the rest of the garment out of the way, because I really just want to stitch the facing and the seam allowance. So I take that first pin out, and I keep my eyeballs focused on the needle and how far away it is from this seam. So I'm keeping it 1/8 of an inch away from that seam as evenly as I can. As I feed it through the machine. And I adjust it every few inches to make sure I'm not sewing over something that I shouldn't be. And that's one of the keys to sewing, is just being aware of all the different parts of your this little piece got caught there. All the different parts that are moving around as you're sewing. Keep this out of the way. adjusting as I go. And I'm continuing right down to the end of the facing. I'm back stitching, pulling it out, clipping my threads and any other random threads that happen to be in there. Apparently there are quite a few. Here we go. And there you can see we've stitched the facing and it is rolling, our facing is rolling nicely to the inside. So that's that. And then the pocket is on this side. And what I'm doing with the pocket is the same thing. I'm pushing my pocket out to the side like this, and I'm pinning the seam allowance to the pocket. I'll do this on both sides, but for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to do the one side. I'll put it in my machine, just like this, making sure that that seam allowance is laying down flat. Take out the first pin, and I'm stitching down the seam allowance towards the pocket. And voila, we have our pocket stitched to our seam allowance, and that way that will hold the pocket on the inside of the dress. Here you can see a close-up of the understitching on my facing. And you can see the seam allowance stitched the facing on the inside. And when we turn it over, you can see that there's no stitching on the outside, which is fantastic. And then as we pan down here to the pocket, we have our understitching in our pocket, which really holds it to the inside.